Hello, my name is Amy Limpetlaw, and I am the head librarian at the Boston University School of Theology Library. The library has sponsored this series of video interviews of faculty members of the School of Theology. Our goal is to showcase, through these interviews, the current work of our faculty authors. Each video runs around 20 to 30 minutes and focuses on a recently published book by the faculty member. We hope these interviews will serve to introduce you to the remarkable work going on at the School of Theology. Enjoy. Hello, I'm Amy Limpetlaw, the head librarian at the School of Theology Library at Boston University. I'm here with Dr. Chris Evans to talk about his new book, Histories of American Christianity, an introduction. Chris, thank you for agreeing to do this interview. This is a very exciting book, and it's very ambitious to do a whole history. Can you tell me about the genesis of the project?
Well, it felt like a very ambitious project, Amy. It was a book that probably was over 8 years in the making.
Wow.
It went through a lot of different evolutions. It was initially conceived of in a somewhat different series that was maybe going to have a little bit more focus on the history of American Protestantism. And then over time, it expanded into the idea of doing a thorough, a comprehensive, but also general study into the development of Christianity in American history. So a lot of the book is an effort to both do a comprehensive summary of some of the major movements, individuals, personalities, that have shaped history, but also to look at the larger impact of religion on American history. I think certain textbooks that have come out before this have either focused on the intellectual development of Christianity, particularly the history of theology. There have been other books that have spent a lot of time looking at different forms of popular religiosity in America. And this book is both an effort to try to integrate those studies, but also to really show the ways in which both popular religion, new religious movements, various personalities historically, as well as just the larger tapestry of history of ideas, history of theologies, have shaped both religious movements, churches, as well as America on the whole. And I think that was one of the things that it was a tough assignment in terms of just the limitations that I had from my publisher with length and the word maximum. But it was a fun project to work on, very rewarding, and so far the reader response to the book seems to be very positive.
That's great. One of the things that I've really liked about reading it was it's very accessible, especially for, not that I'm a complete newcomer to American religious history, but it really brings you in, especially with the way you've used key people's lives to kind of exemplify some of the themes that you've identified. And that, I have a question. It's under 400 pages, so to do a history of the major religious tradition in the United States, Christianity, in such a short space, and yet to do it well and to really give a flavor, how difficult was that to sort of decide what to include and what to exclude?
It was very difficult, Amy, and I think one of the things that I really wrestled with, first of all, was just the particular lenses that I wanted to use. So I spent a lot of time thinking about different churches. I read a lot of previous histories. Obviously, certainly my own research interest played a large role in some of the selection. But I think one of the things that for me was very important, and it picks up on a lot of my previous work, is just the interest that I have in biography. I think biography is a very effective tool in terms of telling stories of history. I think that in many respects, we're seeing a tremendous emphasis from a number of different historians today, and not just in terms of American religion, but just history of Christianity, history of religion, that various scholars today are putting a tremendous emphasis on different roles of biography, both in terms of original knowledge, but also I think is a wonderful teaching tool. I think for a lot of students, sometimes when you read accounts of institutions and churches and denominations, it's very important history. But I tried in this book to think about history from the perspective of different lives, try to come up with a cross-section of important women and men, and also thinking in terms of individuals. Certainly a lot of familiar names. I think for a lot of readers of this book, there'll be a lot of names that they will be familiar with, but also trying to think about individuals that perhaps are not as well known.
That was my favorite part, is when I'd read the story of somebody's life, and you know, and especially how you were able to sort of bring in the themes that you have identified as kind of the key themes of the American Christian history, how those were exemplified in these people's lives, but in different ways each time, which I thought was really, really effective.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's great to hear that. That was my hope, and I tried. Well, just one example that I think is rather interesting. When I'm talking about, in one of the chapters on the early 19th century, and I talk about the rise of evangelical Protestantism, particularly in terms of talking about groups like the Methodists, and also a number of groups that come out of traditions that are often called Restorationism. One of the characters that I picked to kind of tell that story was a relatively, from our standpoint today, a relatively unknown figure named James O'Kelly, who was a Methodist. He was one of, in some respects, one of the early pioneers of American Methodism in the United States, and he was very instrumental in terms of creating a number of the democratic sentiments that would characterize a number of movements of popular religion in the early 19th century. He split from the Methodists, and his legacy would merge, even though his name is forgotten. He is associated with a number of churches that ultimately would form the Disciples of Christ. So I found him a particularly compelling example. I also tried to pay attention to a number of women at different points in the history of Christianity, because I think, again, there have been, certainly we've seen over the last several years a number of very important studies on women in American religion, both in terms of important biographies and trying to retell some of the stories of American Christianity, American religion, from the role that women played. And these are also dimensions that I hope perhaps give an alternative read to some of these other earlier histories.
Well, you're right. I mean, that was the thing, is that a lot of the names I knew, but there were definitely names that I never really read about or heard about before, which really was kind of eye-opening. Was it difficult to choose the people's whose stories to tell?
I will probably be haunted, Amy, in some ways. The trouble when you do a book like this, and again, depending on one's perspective, a book of this size is either a long book or a short book. When you compare the study to some of the other comprehensive works that have been done, and I think of Sidney Alstrom's very famous study in the early 70s, Religious History of the American People. This is a little bit shorter. But there's always, I think, the struggle of whether or not you're excluding particular groups or individuals. And again, a lot of my stress on this book was trying to be original as a scholar and provide a nuanced interpretation, particularly at looking at the importance of American Christianity in particularly its Catholic and Protestant iterations in the United States. Even within those two labels, you have a wide range of diversity in terms of theology, in terms of belief, popular practices, ethnicity, and so on. I tried to pay particular attention to issues of race, certainly the role of African American, the important role of African American Christianity. So there are a number of different dimensions that I think the book touches on, and again, what you're striving for in a book like this is that you want people who are fellow scholars and historians to appreciate your research, but just as important, and probably more important, you want students. You want a general readership, and you want students to learn from the book. And my hope is that this is going to be a resource that is going to help students both understand perhaps more traditional themes, understand some of those traditional narratives, ways of looking at Christianity, particularly for groups like the Puritans and Methodists, and the importance of evangelicalism, religious pluralism that developed later on in the 20th century, and understand some of that ground that other historians have covered, but also maybe looking at some of these themes and issues from somewhat different lenses. And that's where I think, again, the biographical method for me, again, Amy, it's a method I love.
I thought it was really effective.
It's a way that I've done a lot of work with biography before, and really in terms of my future research, it's what I feel passionate about.
Well, can I ask you about your future research?
Certainly.
This is subtitled An Introduction, so I'm wondering, do you envision further volumes or sort of those stories that you weren't able to include but you wanted to, or do you think you'll build on this work?
I certainly will, Amy, in different ways. I mean, one thing, if I could say this, that Baylor University Press, the publisher for this book, has a number of educational resources related to this book that you can find on Baylor's website. So that would be one way for someone to maybe learn a little bit more about this book and explore some of the questions I raised. The next book project that I'm working on now, which again is a long-standing love of mine in terms of my research, is I'm writing another textbook on the history of the social gospel in the United States, looking at the development of a variety of different strands of social Christianity, including Catholic, Protestant, Jewish in particular, focusing on different movements that came out of those traditions. There have been a number of different works that have certainly been done on the social gospel, but this is the first time in a long time that we're developing a new textbook, and I'm very pleased to be working on that. And
so you can go in a little bit more depth than you were able to do in this book on an area that you're really interested in.
That's right.
Yeah, so
that's right.
Great.
That's right.
I know you're a historian, but I'm going to ask a question about the future. You identified a number of themes. The sectarianism and sort of the competition among the religions, among the different strands of Christianity, the Puritan heritage, and especially the idea of the city building a just society. And I'm trying to remember the third one, popular religion. Which I thought was really effective to kind of, as sort of three themes going throughout the book. I know you're a historian and you're not in the business, but what do you see as the future of Christianity in America? And also, one of the things that you talk about in the book is that even though this is a history of Christianity, it's also a history of how Christianity has had an effect upon the history of America as a whole.
That's right.
So what can you make any predictions, or what do you see the trajectory going forward?
Every historian, and you know this, Amy, and I think of a person like Sidney Alstrom, was very quick to say historians should not try to predict the future. But by the same token, we use the past as a way to help students understand some of the issues, patterns that we see in a contemporary context. I think when you look at the history of Christianity, I think there's always a sense today that we live in completely uncharted territory, and that churches, religious institutions are facing something that's completely unique to history. To a degree, I think that's accurate, but I also feel that one of the things that history does for us is it reminds us of the fact that in some ways religious institutions are always in crisis. When you look, again, just going to my book, when you look at the early 19th century, it's a time period where you really have individuals trying to figure out what is the meaning of religion, particularly now that you have religious disestablishment, you've created this completely new free market context in the country. It's important to remember that some of the most prominent religious leaders in the early 19th century didn't feel that Christianity could survive without government sanction, without government support. So in a lot of respects, what you see in America is this sort of battle between what was perceived as new territory. Completely everything has been sort of wiped clean. You've separated yourself from your historical past. But then with the passing of time, all these historical currents start to come back in play again in some way. And I think we live at a time, without diminishing, again, the kind of crisis points that we see with many churches. And again, I reflect on these, where we're talking about a declining number of resources, we're talking about issues of mission, we're talking about theological, ideological divisions. There is a sense that we don't know a lot, in many respects, clear signs for the future. If I had to take a guess, though, Amy, and I say this both from the standpoint of a historian and as a person who is very concerned about the role of faith and ministry and particularly Christianity as we move forward, I think we're certainly going to see a crisis, but I think one of the things that we see today is a great deal of hope. I think questions related to religion and religion's role in American public life are as lively as ever. I think when you look at many people who are pursuing ministry today, yes, it does look very different from 30, 40, 50 years ago, but I think you see the passion in students and in a number of young people to find different ways to serve God and to utilize their gifts for ministry in new ways. So in many respects over the last 10 years, we've already seen people comment on different aspects of Christianity's future, and you've had a lot of predictions. I mean, some people have said that the future is going to be megachurches. Some say that it's going to be small groups. Some continue to cling to the idea of total secularization, which I think when you look at Christianity as a global faith today is really in many respects been disproven. But we see a lot of predictions. We see a number of different theories put forth, but I think we live in a very fluid time. We live in a very uncertain time. But I think one of the lessons that we can take from the study of the past is perhaps people who have lived before us have not necessarily trodden on issues that are completely different from what we've had. That questions of crisis, questions of whether churches are going to survive, these have been around for a long time, and the history of Christianity as a whole represents, I think, the study of a number of movements that have shown their ability, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully, sometimes kicking and screaming, to adapt, to create changes, to be prophetic. But we also know that sometimes institutions do pass out at the same time that new ones are created. So when I look ahead, I think it's an exciting time.
Yeah.
It's a very fluid time, and I think in many ways the study of history can be a way to maybe give us a little bit of reassurance that change is coming, but maybe it's not as catastrophic as we sometimes think it is.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed reading this.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
It's a great achievement, and appreciate you sitting down to talk with me about it.
Amy, it's
Thanks.
my pleasure. Thank you.